The greatest lie we tell ourselves is that suffering is someone else's problem. That's how the visible remains invisible. It's why we don't see the homeless. It's why we don't see the addicted. It's why we avoid tough conversations about things that make us uncomfortable. It's why we don't see the incarcerated and worthy of second chances. It's why we treat homelessness, incarceration, and poverty as if they're someone else's problem. Because it's not our problem, we don't get close, and distance feels easier. But distance doesn't make suffering disappear. It gives it time to grow. And when consequences reach our streets, our doors, our livelihood, our family, suddenly we call what we ignore a crisis. A crisis we like to blame somebody else for. We disconnect from suffering like it's 6 degrees of separation. But the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Homelessness, incarceration, and poverty don't become crises because they're unsolvable. They become a crisis because we distance ourselves from them. We learn how to walk down the street different. We ignore and we look the other way. We create false communities that communicate, stay out. But here's the truth. What we ignore today, it only shows up tomorrow louder. And pretending something isn't a problem, it don't make it not be your problem. Up to this point, it might sound like I'm talking about homelessness, incarceration, and poverty, but I'm not. I'm talking about the premise we all live by, the one that says it's someone else's problem. The moment we decide something belongs to someone else, we give ourselves permission to stay distant, to stay comfortable, to stay uninvolved. And that decision, it doesn't make us bad people. It just makes us human. But it also explains why nothing changes. It's the silent thing we keep in our heads. And we all live by the same premise somewhere. Not just with the homeless, not just with the incarceration, but when everything seems to feel inconvenient, complicated, or uncomfortable, we quietly tell ourselves, somebody else will handle it. I used to think the problem was that people didn't care. But you know what? I don't believe that anymore. I actually think people care deeply and genuinely. We just don't think it's our responsibility until the responsibility we ignore shows up with consequences. I know this premise well because I lived on the other side of it. There was a time when I was the conversation people avoided. When I was the reason they crossed the street. When I was the problem people hope somebody else would fix. I didn't need people talking about me, about how to deal with me, how to handle me. I needed one person who didn't look the other way, just one. One conversation that didn't get avoided, one moment, one responsibility that didn't get passed off, one decision changed everything, not overnight, not cleanly, but over time, completely. Because when one person decided I wasn't someone else's problem, it didn't just change my life. It started a thread. It started what I call a divine thread. And that thread, it keeps showing up, not just in my life, but in the lives all around me. I watched what happens when it changed in people's life, like Tanasa. Tanasa came from prison carrying shame, fear, and quiet expectation that people would keep their distance. And she didn't have a master plan, but we stayed close and she listened, we listened. We trusted her and she trusted us. She went and she showed up. She worked in a pig factory, and now she lives one of our largest programs called Pit Stop, an employment program, restoring dignity on streets, something simple and human, like giving people a restroom and a shower and compassion. She just didn't receive help. She became someone else's reason, somebody that people could rely on. And it wasn't because a program worked. It happened because distance was replaced with trust, and trust became responsibility. I see it every day in my daughter, Annie. She came out of the system into a family that chose proximity and adopted her. And today, she's a homeowner and a wonderful mother and a daughter and a mentor to young women trying to escape crisis that she once lived in. I watch her as she walks alongside single mothers. She doesn't lecture them. She walks with them. Because walking with someone changes things that policy never can. I see it in my spiritual son, Sal Williams. Sal came out of incarceration for drug trafficking, a life he could have went back to. But he chose a different path. We took him in and he took us in. He stayed close and we stayed close. And now he has a family and children and he is doing well. He stands and sits at the table, leading and serving and giving back. He's not just a success story. He's a human being that has been seen and somebody who's believed in. And I've seen it collectively over and over again, men and women who were once homeless, once incarcerated, once ignored, now serving, now leading, entering home ownership, running homelessness and programs, coming out of law school. And there is a reason why this pattern keeps repeating. It's not accidental. And it's not just human compassion. It shows up wherever people stop believing that suffering belongs to someone else. And I believe that we are divinely connected, not abstractly, not practically, but a thread that runs through people, families, neighborhoods, and systems. What happens to one life does not stay with the one life. It ripples and it continues to ripple. And those ripples reach every one of us. And that's why responsibility isn't something we assign, it's something we recognize. Because when we're connected, you don't ask, whose problem is this? You ask, where do I fit? That's why I believe so deeply in the table. Because tables do what walls never will. A table, people are seen, infirmities are not seen. Stories are heard and burdens are shared. We are all equal at the table. Change doesn't start with policy, it starts with proximity. And when people sit at the same tables, business leaders, community members, government, faith leaders, and people with lived experience, we're trying to solve, something shifts. We stop talking about each other and we start sharing with one another. That's not charity. That's connection. This is the space I now stand in. My life is not just about transformation. It's about intersection. I stand at the intersection of people and systems, of lived experience and decision making, of conversations that usually don't happen in the same room. An intersection where stories meet decisions, where what people live through enters the rooms that are decided in. Some days that intersection looks like healthcare and housing at the same table. Other days it looks like recovery meeting employment, then employment meeting dignity. But it always looks like people who were once written off helping shape the very system that once failed them. Now, look, I didn't plan to be here. I just kept noticing the same thread. Lives don't show up in pieces. Pain doesn't stay in one lane. Addiction touches housing. Housing touches mental health. Mental health touches employment. Then employment touches dignity. And when those things don't talk to each other, people fall through the cracks. I know because I lived in those cracks. And there was moments when one misconnection could have ended my story. If one person hadn't decided to stay connected, this talk tonight wouldn't be happening. And that's why I see responsibility as recognition that we already are connected, whether we acknowledge it or not. Transformation doesn't happen because one person does everything. It happens because someone is willing to connect, to facilitate conversation, to bring people to the table, and to empower others to step into their place. That's what the divine thread does. It connects what's been separated. It restores what's been fragmented. It turns isolation into responsibility, not forced, but shared. And this is where your story comes in. This is where the conversation turns to you. Because really, this isn't about homelessness. It's not about incarceration. It's not even about poverty. It's about the premise we all live by. And everyone in this room has already decided, consciously or not, what we're responsible for and what we're willing to ignore. And the consequences don't care where you draw the line, because the line moves anyway. It moves through families, through neighborhoods, and through our cities. Until one day, what felt distance feels very close. So maybe the question isn't, why doesn't somebody fix it? Maybe the question is simpler. Who and what am I already connected to? Because divine connection doesn't ask us to do everything. It just asks us to do our part. It says do something in proximity, in conversation, in partnership. And whether we acknowledge it or not, we already are a part of each other's story. We are not separated by 6 degrees of separation. We're connected by 1 degree, 1 thread, 1 decision to see or to look away. And the truth is, family, you are already closer than you think.